No, I don't feel like you're hearing me. I didn't ask how big the room was. I didn't ask if we had finished evacuating the orphans. I said I cast Fireball.
You will fall before us.
I don't think I will. Hello everybody and welcome to another one of my build guide videos. I am Bryan the Pirate. Before we begin, I think I should provide you with a warning. If this is your first character, either of early access or in a league if you're watching this video far into the future, perhaps don't play this build. The reason for that is because it is a Deadeye. It's not a witch. It's not a sorceress. It is the bow and arrow lady. And of course, when you're starting off as the bow and arrow lady, you're in a very specific area of the tree that has a distinct lack of caster-based passive nodes, and that's going to be an issue for you, which means you actually want to start leveling. In my case, I was leveling as a lightning rod and lightning arrow ranger, and when I got to Act 3, that's when I then respect. And obviously to do that, I had to have about, I don't know, a lot of gold, an amount that was required to reallocate my passives, and then I spent around about 5 to 10 exalts buying caster-based gear to replace like my bow and arrow and quiver and stuff like that. However, when you do respec at around about Act 3 in normal, it's a dream. It's actually very, very cheap. All the items that I acquired were basically mana, life, and res, all for 1 exalt each, and then I just blasted my way through the campaign, all the way through to endgame maps, with that same gear. I didn't need to upgrade from Act 2 gear at any point. It was very, very nice. Another thing to consider is the late game slash end game version of this build is dependent on 2 unique items. You've got the snake pit ring and then some gloves that I can't remember the name of, but they're on screen right now. I think it's blue flame or something like that. These make the build what it really, really is. And I'll explain why later in the video. One final thing to point out as well is, if you haven't noticed already, visual clarity is a bit of a, let's say, issue for this build. If you're quite quick-fingered and you're very good at dodging, you're probably not going to come across many issues, but every now and then you might die to something and have no idea what killed you until the fireballs dissipate, and then you suddenly notice that there was a degen pool underneath your character's feet that you just couldn't see. Things like that. Otherwise, you don't really have to worry about enemies hitting you because everything will be frozen. More on that later. So first I'll just show you the very basics of the character, then I'll go over the skill gems and then the passive skill tree, then potential changes that I will make in the future or as I level, especially when we have more base items added into the game, but again, more on that later. First and foremost though, we've got a hashtag not a sorceress, because everyone in all the videos was like, is that a sorceress? Is that a witch? And despite the caption saying Deadeye, that question just came up all the time, and I was very tired of it. So hashtag not a sorceress. This is my stats. Not quite res capped at level 76. Pretty mediocre in the grand scheme of things. I've got relatively decent gear, but there's definitely room for improvement by a long shot, if anything. And I'm very happily clearing T5 tier 6 maps at the moment, hoping to keep pushing into the double figures and maybe doing some pinnacle content as well later on. So first, we're going to go over the gems. Now, you've got Power Siphon. This comes with the wand. We don't care about Power Siphon. It has nothing to do with this build. Then we have Fireball. So Fireball is the main build, and it is, of course, a fire skill. However, when I show you the gear, you'll find out that fire is not the objective of this build. It is, in fact, cold, which is why you'll notice a bunch of cold skills as well later in this video. But for Fireball, we want to get as many levels as possible just to get some more damage output out of it. We've got Unleash, because that casts more fireballs whenever you build up 2 seals like this. That also was triggered with Wild Shards, so you can have those 2 things trigger at the same time, which can be quite meaty. Otherwise, that's what it would normally look like when there is Unleash and things like that. Then you've got Ricochet. Now, this one's really, really important. This is what makes it bounce off terrain. Now, this provides 20%. This isn't the only source of Ricochet. There's also some nodes on the passive tree that I'll show you later. You've got Wild Shards, which is what makes it spawn in a circle and fires an additional 8 projectiles. That also scales with additional projectiles, so it actually fires, I think, around about 15 at this point. And then we've got Scatter Shot as well, which adds the 2 additional projectiles at the cost of slightly slower cast speed and slightly less damage. But as you've seen, that's not a problem. Now, eventually, we're going to have a 6th slot. I am actually still undecided as to what that should be. Part of me is like, oh, we should maybe make it fire penetration or something else. But I'm in 2 minds about that. And that's because of a specific node that's on the passive skill tree that we're using. And the only time that fire penetration is actually going to do anything is in specific boss fights, which we may be able to overcome in different ways. And you'll understand what I mean later in the video. We've got Cast on Freeze. Oh, but Bryan, Cast on Freeze was nerfed. Yes, it was nerfed. Against trash mobs, it's okay. Honestly, it still procs like relatively often, but this is here mostly for the bossing. It's just some extra sources of damage when we're fighting bosses, extra sources of freeze because it's a big chunky cold damage, and we've got energy retention, so it procs more frequently, and we've got spell cascade, so it procs more frequently. We've got hypothermia. I think this one's pretty obvious. It's minus resistances to cold. Of course, that's what we've got. We've got burning inscription, which is, again, more for bosses. It leaves like a little burny bit of damage behind, which gets converted to cold. And again, that's just a source of additional deeps for the poops and giggles, because there's not much else we can really put in it. Persistence, because we want it to last for as long as possible. And heightened curse, because we want the effect of the curse to be as strong as possible. We've got elemental invocation. Again, pretty self-explanatory. It's just another source of being able to spam Comet. We've got Spell Echo with that one, and Impetus, so it can proc more frequently. When it comes to the remaining slots, I have no idea what to put in these. Honestly, I don't think we have enough skill gems yet to really properly flesh out the last remaining slots, but we'll see in the future, and if there are any major changes, I will, of course, put out an updated video. We've got Flame Wall. Now, Flame Wall is technically just another source of damage. We don't really care about the dot damage. We care about the projectiles which pass through the wall, deal an extra 64 to 91 added fire damage. Now, interestingly, this is the only source of fire damage that we'll have on the build. It doesn't get converted to cold for some bizarre reason. Don't know if that's an oversight on GGG's part or if it's working as intended. Maybe we'll find out in the future. But the idea of Firewall is you'd either cast it around the boss, and then that way, when the missiles or projectiles are flying around, it is guaranteed to pass through it before hitting it. Or if you're mapping, maybe you'll cast it around yourself, because again, it's guaranteed to light them up. But when you're obviously fighting against the boss, it's probably easy to whack it around the boss because you're going to be moving a lot to avoid any big beefy attacks. With that, we've got Fortress to obviously make it a circle. We've got Concentrated Effect because we just want some more damage at the sake of making it smaller, because you don't need it to be massive. To be honest, it will always encircle the thing you're trying to kill. And then, of course, we've got +1 to skills, which is, again, just to beef up those projectiles. Arctic Armor. This one I kind of just threw on for poops and giggles. It's a little bit of, not damage mitigation, but it can help you out a little bit when things do somehow manage to get a little bit too close. It does cold damage to things that get within melee range, and it knocks them back. So it's like utility damage mitigation rather than direct damage mitigation. And of course, you get 4% of life recovered on kill while a supported skill is active. You could, if you get enough spirit, also swap that out for, I believe it's vitality, which is just constant life regen, but I believe it's only 1 or 2%, despite depending on the level. In fact, no, it doesn't scale with level, so ignore that. It's 2%, I believe. The last slot, I'm probably going to get clarity, because this build goes through mana. It goes through mana real quick, especially if you're casting things like hypothermia and stuff as well. It just burns through it. So you want as much mana regen as possible. Potentially in the future, there may be other things that I can get into the build to cover or recover mana a bit more efficiently. But for now, we're just basically relying on a big mana pool and just mana regen on items and on auras. Now, in the future, there is one change that we may make depending on how daggers work. Daggers aren't currently in the game. In PoE 1, there are 2 types of daggers, though. There's the stabby kind, and there's the slightly less stabby kind that are based around casting, so you can get caster modifiers on them. The reason that's important is that would then mean it's classed as a martial weapon, and with martial weapons, you can get Herald of Ice, which means anything that dies whilst frozen explodes, which is very satisfying to actually play, and also more damage. So in the future, if we get daggers, do also remember or consider getting a lot more spirit to then whack in Herald of Ice, just for that peak map clear. Next, I'm going to go over the items. The items are pretty, for lack of a better word, basic bitch, aside from 2 that I specified earlier, so we'll cover those first. So you got the blue flame braces. Now, at the moment, I've just got some cheap corrupted ones. Depending on if this video pops off, you might want to buy these gloves and the snake pit ring as soon as possible, because if this video becomes particularly popular, it will, of course, affect the price of these items. I got a corrupted one with just 1 socket and no corruption on it, because it made it a lot cheaper. I think I picked these up for like 4 exalts. Ideally, what you'd want is corrupted with 2 sockets, and hopefully with armor applied to it, or armor thingies. The thing that increases your armor, I can't remember what they're called. Armor scrap, maybe? I don't know. But either way, you want 2 sockets, and then you can whack 2 of these in it. Soul Cores of the Chipotle, as I call them, which give you +5 to all elemental resistances. And that way you would have +10 to elemental resistances. Or you could get +14 to chaos resistance if you manage to top up your resistances elsewhere. But the key part of these gloves is the 100% of fire damage converted to cold damage. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It freezes everything. When you're doing maps, everything freezes immediately. You don't even need a massive amount of freeze buildup, because everything gets so frequently hit by your projectiles, it just applies it. Likewise for bosses, it builds up pretty quickly. I have been tempted to try and spec into a bit more freeze buildup, just so it can, again, do it a lot more like quicker on bosses. Maybe that 6th gem, I will put glaciation in there for that 50% freeze buildup. We'll have to see. But that's why you want those gloves. Cold damage equals freeze equals you are safe, because nothing can hit you. Then we've got the snake pit ring. 10% increased cast speed, pretty self-explanatory. 27% spell damage, self-explanatory. More cast speed, self-explanatory. The next and important bit, though, is ring slot on the right. Projectiles from spells chain +1 time. So you need to make sure the ring is in this slot, not this one, specifically in this slot, and it allows the fireballs and the projectiles that burst from the fireballs to chain an additional time at no penalty to damage. Whereas if you use the chain support, for example, I think it's like -50% damage, which is obviously huge, especially when you can combine that with the -20% with scattershot as well. Whereas this, it gives you the +1 chain for free. The other ring at the moment is 10 chaos resistance, bit of life, bit of mana, bit of cast speed. This is very basic. As you see, it's level 36. This is one of the rings that I bought when I was still in Act 3, and I just have yet to replace it. I'll probably get something that has a lot more mana regen, maybe some resistances if I don't make them up elsewhere. We'll have to see. But yeah, that's essentially what you want on pretty much all your gear. Mana, life, cast speed, and regen. Likewise, the focus is lots of damage, spell damage, cold damage. In this case, I've gone for crit and spell and cast speed. I've just socketed some cold res into it. Maybe I would forfeit the critical hit. Like, I'll explain this a bit more when we get to the passive skill tree. I think I'm going to lean into crits, but it needs a bit more testing because there's a couple of options. Like I said, we could go with a lot more pen. Maybe we can go with a lot more crit. And if we go with crit, we're going to focus with crit on the passive tree. Or maybe you actually just want more defenses. Who knows? It's entirely up to you and how comfortable the build feels to you in the content that you're doing at the time, I think is the best way to consider it. The weapon, very, very basic bitch. +4 to all fire spells. This means that it buffs the projectiles that you enchant through firewall, but also, of course, your fireballs themselves. It, of course, does not affect the comet spells, unfortunately. I tried to see if you could get +4 fire spell skills and then plus cold damage. I don't think you can get both of them at the same time. There never seems to be any items available with those two stats on the trade website. So I'm still a bit like, what do I actually want for like my 6th stat on the weapon? Maybe you've got a suggestion. Otherwise, lots of mana, lots of spell damage, and cast speed as before. The helmet you specifically, or I at least specifically, went for an energy shield helmet, and you just want it to be pure energy shield and as much as possible. This will then scale with a node that I'll show you in the passive skill tree. Likewise, for the armor, you want evasion only, because eventually of a node that you will get that will scale additional energy shield based on how much evasion your armor has. I'm still in two minds on whether or not I'm actually going to get it. Maybe I'll anoint it. It depends on if I really need the defenses when I start getting into like tier 10 onwards when it comes to mapping. The amulet is just a big source of mana, regen, and spirit. This is what I tried crafting. I got the fire and the cold, and I was like, sorry, the fire and the chaos, and the big mana, and I was like, maybe I can get something, oh, mana regen. Maybe I can get some other stuff. Unfortunately, it slammed accuracy and rarity onto the amulet, so I was a bit sad face about that. But it's not too bad. You could otherwise, of course, get plus skills. That will make it very expensive, of course, and I believe you can also get spell damage, which again can make it quite expensive. The belt is resistances, life, armor, whatever. Again, just lots of defenses. The boots, get as much move speed as you can, some res, some mana. Ideally, I'd probably want some life on there as well. It's very generic when it comes to most of the gear, like just your basic caster stuff and some defenses. That is the gear. And once again, just to remind you, get this and this as soon as possible when you see this video. Otherwise, they might be very, very expensive later on. Next, I'm going to show you the passive skill tree and the ascendancy. Now, I have yet to do my 3rd and 4th ascendancies, mostly because I want to actually move on to doing my 2nd build. Also, because I did the Sanctum run, or the Trial of Sekima, or whatever it's called, for my 3rd ascendancy, and then screwed up the final boss when they were just about to die, and it made me a salty bitch, and I've not been in there since. So yeah, there's that, but we don't talk about that. Otherwise, what you want to do is you want to spec into Far Shot. Projectiles deal 0% more hit damage to targets in the first 3.5 meters of their movement, scaling up with distance traveled to reach 20% after 7 meters. Everything's bouncing off the walls. It's going to get a lot of travel time. That's why we go for that one. You do, in a lot of cases, hug the bosses, so you could consider getting the, I believe it will be point blank, which is like the opposite of this, but the vast majority of the projectiles are going to miss initially, bounce off everything, and then hit eventually. So I think Far Shot is the better option. And this is the primary reason why I actually chose the Deadeye. Skills, fire, and additional projectile. It's a free additional projectile. Whilst you're leveling, it means you're firing out 2 before you've even got any items that give you any more. Literally what inspired this build. I've used Deadeye in PoE 1 to do similar spellcasting builds. What I would then get is Tailwind. The reason we want Tailwind is pretty obvious, but if you're new to the game, I'll explain. Tailwind is a stacking buff which grants 1% increased movement speed, 3% increased skill speed, so in this case cast speed, and 15% increased evasion rating per stack for 10 seconds, refreshing when you gain another stack, a maximum of 10 stacks. When you're mapping, you're going to have 10 stacks perpetually, which means you're going to have 10% increased movement speed, 30% increased cast speed, and 150% increased evasion. So it's lots of defense, a little bit of extra movement speed, and of course that's cast speed. It's a fantastic node to have, especially if you get your 4th ascendancy, and then you get 3% less damage taken per tailwind. So you'll have 30% flat damage reduction, or global damage reduction, I should say. So physical, elemental, chaos, all of it. It's reduced by 30% when you're at maximum stacks. So that's going to be the play. Very, very powerful ascendancy. Deadeye is huge. Honestly, I genuinely prefer it for casters than the actual caster nodes, the caster ascendancies at this point, but that could get balanced later on. Now, what I'm going to do is go over some of the notable nodes that you're going to want for sure. I'll go over this one first. This one is currently being provided to me by my amulets because I just happen to have the catalysts for it, or the whatever you call them, the oils, the greeds, the ires, whatever. So I've whacked that on, but as you can see, I'm actually progressively going to make my way there. Eventually, when I get that, my intent is to get, very likely, either all natural, if I still need resistances. If I don't need resistances, I'm probably going to get storm charged, which gives you 40% increased elemental damage if you've dealt a critical hit recently, which you will have. Basically, that's 40% uptime perpetually, because you're firing off 60 projectiles. One of them is going to crit. I did toy with getting maybe this as my anoint, +1 to maximum energy shield per 12 evasion rating on equipped body armor. That's what I was referring to earlier when I was showing you the gear. Eventually, I do intend on pathing to this. There are a couple of other nodes around here that I want. For example, there's the crit nodes here, so I may come down this way. But I'm still undecided, if I'm being perfectly honest. There's a couple of other crit nodes that I also want around here. But we'll see. That's, again, assuming that I don't end up going for, like, cold res. But it depends. There's like 20 skill points still to get. 24 at this point still to get. So there's options, but very likely going to get that at some point. Just to get a big juiced up bit of energy shield added to my build. Otherwise, the notables are Hound Instincts, mostly because you have to get it when you come through here. Attack speed, projectile speed, doesn't really do a lot, but it is what it is. You could alternatively just go through the nodes if you wish. It's a bit up in the air on whether that's going to be the best or not. But the other thing to get is increased projectile damage. The pierce doesn't work, but it's there. Again, you might want to go this route just to save some. That's entirely up to you. To be honest, I probably will like respec out of these. This is mostly like from when I was leveling up and I just haven't gotten around to doing it properly. Cat-like agility, evasion rating. Obviously, extra defenses, you absolutely want that. Then we've got escape velocity, additional evasion rating, additional movement speed. Movement speed is king in these games. Then we've got trick shot. Projectiles have 15% chance to chain an additional time from terrain. So that works really well with ricochet. That puts it up to 35% rather than just 20%. On the way there, I've whacked in a jewel, which just does additional projectile damage. It's one I just happen to have. Obviously, I would want something a bit more specialized for my jewel sockets, but that's what I've got for now. Then we have Subterfuge Mask, +2 evasion rating per 1 maximum energy shield on equipped helmet, which is why my helmet is all energy shield, because then we get evasion from it anyway. Then we've got gained 5% of damage as extra cold damage, plus 20% increased freeze buildup. That is mostly for bosses. As I said, without any freeze buildup, you freeze the entire map anyway, but we want to get some stacked up for when we're doing bosses. Then we've got 20% increased mana regeneration rate and 8% reduced mana cost of skills. As I said, the skills are prohibitively expensive, so if you can get mana reduction, you will absolutely need it. Then we have got 30% increased elemental damage if you've chilled an enemy recently, which is all the time. Up here, we've got 12% of spell skills, 12% chance for spell skills to fire 2 additional projectiles. Likewise, another 6%, 4%, another 6%, and another 4% there. That likewise combines with these nodes up here, which brings it up to 50%. So every other shot fires an additional 2 projectiles. All the projectiles. Likewise, you want 20% increased projectile speed for spells, mostly because this one slows them down. And I thought, why would you do that? So get them to be faster by going for that one. I've, at the moment, got Ingenuity just to give me a fat stack of int. Potentially, when I've got some later and more end game gear, more end game gear, I may spec out of it. It's just to make sure I can actually keep up with leveling up my spells, because of the items that I have. It means like Fireball is level 20, which requires 146 int, for example, things like that. But potentially with gear, I may get rid of those. Then we have 20% increased freeze buildup. Hits ignore elemental resistances of frozen enemies. So this is why I said that penetration isn't really a big deal, because in mapping, everything's frozen. So there's no resistances to penetrate, because penetration doesn't go below 0. So that's why I'm like, should I lean into crit for bossing? But I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. But otherwise, mapping is made extraordinarily easy because of this one node. Likewise, we've got increased freeze buildup on thin ice and 50% increased damage with hits against frozen enemies, which is all enemies all the time, aside from bosses. Then over here, we have damage penetrates 15% cold resistances, plus 10%. I've got that at the moment because of bossing. I may again potentially spec out of it when we get more crit. And then over here, we've got exploit the elements, 24% increased damage with hits against enemies affected by elemental ailments, i.e. things that are frozen, 30% increased chance to inflict ailments against rare and unique enemies, i.e. bosses. Then of course, we've got increased cold damage and build-up with Path of Winter, and then we've got more spell damage here. That, at the moment, is the build, as it were. There could be another 24 nodes that we can whack in. I'm contemplating going down the crit node route. I believe there's another crit node around here. So there's that one. I think there was another couple that I was considering. Oh, there's also these ones up here. I was tempted to go this route to get that, and then these crit nodes. So increased damage when you do a critical hit, crit chance, more crit damage bonus, more critical hit chance. Still undecided, as I mentioned. Potentially, you might actually want to go into more evasion, more energy shields, some more of the defensive nodes, because for the mapping, from what I can tell so far, I haven't done any tier 10 and plus maps. The damage might be fine. It could be that I just don't need any more damage and I'm just going to need more defenses. Ultimately, I'm going to leave that up to you to decide, because you're going to know how comfortable you are in the content that you're doing. I'm not just going to assume that you're a god gamer like me and you can just dodge everything ever. But, you know, do what you feel is right for you. Otherwise, what you are seeing now, is the main part of the build. Now, I mentioned earlier, there are potentially going to be daggers added to the build, which will mean that you can get casting affixes on those daggers. In that case, you might want to spec into these, which is 32% increased spell damage while wielding a melee weapon. It's nice and close. Again, it'll bring you closer to the evasion node over here. It's free damage, and then, like I said, you'll be using Herald of Ice as well for even better clear. Otherwise, I don't think I would change a lot other than what I've mentioned already. I'm pretty happy where this is going. It's very comfortable. Mapping feels fantastic, and it's just a dream to play, especially when you are in a map where there's a lot of walls, basically. Like in open areas, the damage falls off a little bit. Like, it doesn't become bad, but it's not insta-gib everything ever when in comparison to, say, like the crypt, where it's all linear tunnels and stuff like that. If you are mapping, try and lean towards things that are in interiors rather than exteriors. Avoid open fields if you can, or maps that are usually out in the open. Things with forests in are pretty good because it can ricochet off the trees and stuff like that, but you don't want to do anything that's just literally a wide open field. It's doable, it's just not as fast. It doesn't feel as good. In fact, it's more than doable. But when you enter something like the crypt, you're just like, oh, everything died with one button click because it just bounced off everything and just murders the entire screen. And it's really satisfying, as I said. That is the DEADEYE Fireball build. I haven't got a better name for it so far. I was considering something wacky and weird, like I saw a spider, so I set everything on fire. But of course it does cold damage now, so that doesn't really make any sense. As for my next build, I'm currently in the process of making a Titan that uses a crossbow and grenades. Because if you haven't noticed, on this channel, I like to make builds that are a little off meta, a little out of the usual archetypes. And if that's the type of content you like to see, you should probably subscribe, maybe hit the like button, because it helps me a lot, frankly. And it would be really, really nice if you come around and watch some other build videos sometime, you know? I'm also a Twitch streamer and can be found on all the social media as Bryan the Pirate. So Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, all of it. Bryan the Pirate. So maybe consider following, liking, doing all that shenanigans over there as well. Otherwise, treat yourself to some cake. Everyone deserves to treat themselves every now and then. Thank you all very much for watching. Farewell. I'll remember you.